welcome. I'm Katie Georgiadis, and I'd like to welcome you to this event where we'll be talking about the transition from research to development. First, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a consultant at Halloran Consulting Company, and this is a life science consulting firm. We like to think of ourselves as end-to-end development partners for our clients. We get involved very early at company formation, and then we kind of shepherd our clients through discovery, early clinical development, late clinical development, all the way to commercial assessment and approval. My particular area of expertise is early stage companies, and I often work with clients who are in this space of transitioning from research to development, and I offer strategic input, how to move their product as quickly as possible, but not cut too many corners, and make sure you do the right kind of studies to get that approval. And it's all about safety, so that's what we're after, and helping get patients the therapies that they need. So with that, I'm very excited about this topic. And this is something that I'll just spend a couple minutes and then I'll introduce my fellow panelists here. So this is an area that I think about a lot, this transition. As I said, I support clients through this, but it's often, there's a lot of excitement in the research domain when you have a product that works, you've shown some preclinical efficacy, you have a candidate, and then you need to shift gears. So that's what we'll be talking about. What exactly should you be thinking about? How early? What kind of regulatory input should you seek? And such. So with that, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. So take it over. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Amanda Wagner. I'm the CEO of Immunitas Therapeutics. We're a precision oncology company, Series B, just entered the clinic. And so this is really an appropriate time for us to be having this conversation. And we are biomarker-based target discovery and then biomarker-based patient selection. I grew up actually in R&D, in translational program management early in my career, so have pushed multiple compounds through this transition, as well as multiple companies through this transition. So excited to be here with all of you this morning.
Okay. My name is Praveen Tipraneni. I'm the CEO of Morphic Therapeutic. We are a structure-based drug design company focused on the integrin target class. So this is a company we've been, actually looking at LinkedIn, it's my 8-year anniversary today of Morphic. Yeah. So it's been great going from essentially an idea to earlier this year we announced phase 2A results, which were positive, and so it's been a great journey, taking a number of compounds from research development. And one thing I'll just add right at the get-go is I think this is a surprisingly talked about topic. It's like you'd be surprised how many companies at the end sort of attribute this transition to being the downfall of the company. So I think it's one that it's really important to get right.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Jennings. I'm a director HR business partner with Delphi Diagnostics. Delphi is focused on early cancer detection through machine learning, and right now we're specifically focusing on lung cancer. My career has mostly been in aerospace and defense, so this is my first time in life sciences as well as in a startup. So it's been a very equally challenging and rewarding experience thus far. So really excited to be here with you this morning.
Great, thank you for those introductions. So I'll kick off the questions kind of with one directed to Praveen and to Amanda, just about telling us what you think about this transition. How do you think about the transition from research to development? And if you can kind of describe that, just to kind of set the stage for the whole panel discussion.
Yeah, so I would say there are core pieces that are very similar between research and development. So as we look at that transition, clearly the identification of a pathway that is this sort of a critical path needs to be executed extremely well. I think both of those pieces really translate between both spaces. But the stakes go up a lot when you go into development in terms of the time that it takes, in terms of the expense that it takes, and in terms of the spotlight that is on the program. And so I think there's just an increasing awareness of that as you move into development. And then obviously there's all the pieces around clinical data and patient information and all of those pieces that come into play as well. So I think there's sort of a core thread of really fantastic execution and great people, but around that, there's flux in terms of how much flexibility you have once you start something and the spotlight that's on it.
Yeah. Yeah, especially with the kind of environment we've been in that's very, fundraising is very tough and budgets are really tight. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think Amanda captured well the kind of the transition and the differences in mentality and the focus there. I think one thing that I'll add to that is the people aspect, and I think that's a hard one to get right here. And let me just set the stage. It's the discovery folks have spent years, coming up with a compound that they're able to nominate as a development candidate. So they've struggled with this for years, solved innumerable challenges, and finally nominate a development candidate. They, at some level, are very careful and don't want to hand off their baby to somebody else. They want to know who they're handing it off to. And now you look at the other side of it, the people who are receiving it, it's going to take them some time for them to learn that compound and all the aspects of it in the same way that the discovery folks know it, right? And so that first few 6 months there are just filled with peril because any misstep by the development folks are like, I told you, that wasn't the right person. And so it's a very difficult transition to make. And so I think those people issues and being able to coordinate those teams between discovery and development are surprisingly challenging.
Right, so that's a great segue for Michelle to comment about that, being in HR, and tell us about what you think about in terms of balancing that, bringing new people in as well as shifting folks within the organization into different roles.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are all about internal mobility. And for employees who have both the skill and the will to transition over, we are more than happy to support that. Last year, we had our first talent review where we kind of looked at everyone in the organization and really focused on our talent landscape, understanding the skills that we had in the organization, but also understanding employees' career development. And so really understanding how we can deploy internal talent when we decide to go to market. Like, do we have the people internally or do we need to go externally? But with that, I think it's a really critical time to make sure you have the right people in the organization from a mindset perspective, because it's you have people who have been in that unregulated phase and they like that. They like kind of the carefree, the freedom of that. But when you're moving to development and you have regulation, you have compliance, a lot of people don't want to do that. So you want to make sure that they have that long-term view that comes with that compliance and regulation and things like that. And I think that's where your connectedness to the mission, the culture, the values really come through to those who otherwise might not want to be part of that.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And one of the things that we encounter at Halloran, we often have clients that work with us and they haven't really thought about the processes and the regulatory kind of aspects and how stringent they need to be internally. So what are some of the, how have you navigated that through your, like Amanda and Praveen, have you thought about that?
Oh, sure. I do actually think at this stage it is individual to a program, right? Because I don't think each program there's a cookie cutter model for across every program. At least that's been my experience. Because there are programs that, let's just say, the regulatory path is well defined, right? Which is the case in certain indications. That you could have a more project management aspect to that right from the get-go, and that one, especially if you've had that indication in your organization before. A lot of those processes are built up and it's a little bit more straightforward. On the other hand, you could have one that the science is extremely novel, right, and extremely complicated and very on the cutting edge, where the development folks have never even approached something like this before, right, and that takes a different type of person and a mentality. So I do, at least where I've come out, is that it's hard to find a cookie cutter model for this. I do feel that each program, you have to look at the situation, the science, the development path, and look at the people that fit that particular situation.
Yeah, I'll build off that on the people comment. I think a lot of this conversation is going to come back to people in general. But I think on the regulatory side, part of what's really important is to find a regulatory person, whether it's an in-house person that you hire or an external consultant or consulting group that you're working with, that really reflects the risk appetite of the organization and the profile, to Praveen's point, the profile of the program, right? Because again, there are some where it's a very well-known path, and there's some where you're really carving the path. And you have to think about the company's appetite for going back to the FDA to ask questions or proposing something novel, a new way of doing things, and then incorporating FDA feedback in order to do it well. And I think that will vary. It'll vary by management team. It'll vary by program. It varies by corporate culture.
Yeah, those are great points, yeah. So I'd like to now ask a little bit about kind of leadership, the role of leadership, and how do you think the leadership team can really influence and manage these changes internally. So Praveen, do you want to?
And when we talk about leadership, are you talking about the project leadership or more the senior leadership?
No, it's senior leadership, the CEO, the C-suite folks who are.
I mean, I think especially when we're talking about biotech, right? The development candidate is a key milestone, right? That can trigger financing events. It can trigger tranches of already pre-committed financing, triggers oftentimes, in certain cases it didn't for us, but a lot of times it can even trigger press releases and things like that. And so it is a big transition, and so just naturally, in a biotech, the senior management is highly involved, or at least highly informed of the whole situation. And so I do think that usually through either some sort of governance leadership meeting, or depending on the model, oftentimes you see kind of a Uber project manager that reports directly to the senior management, a very kind of close communication with the senior management, and actually oftentimes even the board. So in these early biotech companies.
Yeah, I would add that I think the senior leadership team often, to Michelle's point, really sets the culture around what it means to be in development. And so to her point about how do you move people through, I think one of the things that I've learned in very small biotech, so we're about 20 people. This is the 4th startup I've been a part of that's on that kind of scale. And one of the things we found is that it's incredibly helpful to, bring in the development people early, to Praveen's point about making sure that everyone's on board with what's happening in the program and what the long-term program strategy is. I think the earlier that you can get folks like your CMO and regulatory and ClinOps sort of engaged in the program as it's reaching development candidate stage, the more buy-in you're going to have from both sides of that table. And then the other piece is pulling forward some of those research people who want to see that translational process, who want to be part of early stage development. And so that involves having in our case, we're an antibody company, so some of our protein science team also sits in our CMC meetings, and there's that pull through. And especially in program management, I grew up in that translational program management role. And I think there's real value in having a program manager who can follow the program through the IND enabling process and really into phase 1. And then you think about the handoff to a phase 2, phase 3 style program manager. But I think having someone who can live and breathe that translational process and help that bridge is incredibly valuable.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the one tricky part of that, at least in my experience, is that you're always sort of calibrating, the people for kind of where you are, right? And so oftentimes you're hesitant to hire people until if the development candidate gets through early talks, and also, in certain cases, you can't hire a CMO until you get to a certain stage, and so oftentimes you can't get a CMO at if it's your first development candidate. Oftentimes that's not enough to attract kind of the CMO that you're looking for. I think that's the tricky sort of balance there, is because you probably don't have the full set of capabilities that you need internally, and possibly you could get it, but you want to be careful because what if that candidate doesn't move forward, right? And then you're sort of stuck with costs and things like that you may not need for a little while.
Yeah, and I'll add on that and just say, in our case, a lot of those people have been consultants and advisors that have helped with that pull through for exactly that reason.
Just quickly to add, I think leadership has a huge role in just setting the tone for collaboration. There's not one function that's more important than the other. Their work isn't more important than the other, but we all need to come together as a collective to make sure that, you know, we get through this phase. And I think that's really is top down from the leadership.
So another question I have is about long-range planning. So I often, encounter clients who are like, well, that's too early to be thinking about this. You know, we've got 6 months or a year or whatever. And so how early would you say should you start that process? And do you have any tips you can share about getting buy-in from the research staff, which sometimes I think there's a little bit of resistance to kind of laying out the plans long term. I'm talking, 3 to 5 years or beyond even. So I don't know who would like to answer that first.
No, I think certainly, at least for us, I mean, I think that 3 to 5 year planning can come much earlier than that even, right? Because I think, we had 3 to 5 year planning, actually pretty much from the get-go, right? Because you're going to have to know kind of what your investment requirements are, and that's going to very much kind of define how, what flexibility you have, what, tests you can do, how far you can take it, and things like that. And so when you're talking 3 to 5 year plan, I think, program by program basis, I think when we were like 3 people, we had, 3 to 5 year plans.
Yeah, I'll say that we laid out a 5-year vision, and we laid out about a 3-year plan. And I wish that I could tell you that 3-year plan was exactly what we're doing. But I think one of the things we have to keep in mind here is that the market has shifted dramatically. And so from our perspective, the name of the game is really adaptability. It's flexibility. So, it is a little early to plan what you're going to be doing 3 years from now when you're at a development candidate stage, right? Especially if you're in a place where the regulatory path hasn't been well worn. But we need to put some baseline stakes in the ground around what our assumption is that we can do all of that financing plan. And then you just acknowledge that that's going to have to flex. And we don't know exactly how it's going to flex, right? It's partly going to flex based on internal things like how our data is reading out and how strong that is and what kind of p-values we're going to need. And on the other hand, it's going to flex because of external market conditions and other external forces that we don't have any control over. And so I think part of what's really critical, especially when you're talking about a company that's in the 20 person range, right, is that you need to be hiring people that can do that flex, that can adapt, and that can say, yes, I understand that we're putting stakes in the ground for the 3-year plan and that we're going to be somewhere within the range of that 3-year plan, but that we're going to have to adapt based on the data that comes out and the external conditions that are in play.
Yeah, that all makes sense. The other thing to consider also is sort of how this first indication and this first development candidate will kind of inform additional expansion of the indications, or if it's a platform, moving across. So how does that work in terms of in your organization? Do you focus on the single asset, or do you kind of plan out more? And how do you navigate that? Because in a small organization, there's limited, you have limited folks as well as your budget. But yeah, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I would say in our experience, it varies a little based on the biology of the specific program. I think some programs have a lot more opportunity to go broadly across multiple indications, and then it's a question of where can you show proof of concept most efficiently to enable yourself to finance for the additional indications. And some of them are much more specific. I mean, I think especially as you get deeper and deeper into sort of biologically driven patient selection, where you're addressing a particular target in a particular patient that has a certain expression level, and we see that with a lot of the personalized medicine approaches, right? I think at that point, it's really a question of how far can you push that biology and what is the broader market opportunity there. Mm-hmm. So I think it varies based on the program.
Yeah, I think at least the typical biotech problem, right? Because at least in the last few years, we've seen so many platforms, and essentially platforms were kind of the startup model. Even though now we're a little bit more in the product mode because of the economics, but we've for the last few years been very heavy platform dependent. And so I always say that every startup is basically a quest for credibility, right? And so it really depends on what level of capitalization you have, right? Is how many you can bring forward. And each of these steps, even the ones that we talked about putting plans together, even if they're definitely going to change, right? But all those are kind of steps of getting credibility with your board, with your investors, getting a license to, bring future ones forward. And so I think that's the thing to think about, that each step of the way, you're gaining credibility with all the stakeholders, which allows you to do much more, which allows you to get financing to bring more development candidates forward, or you're going to be sort of stuck in that mode where, after your first development candidate, all the capital goes to that one, and then the rest of the platform gets, unfortunately, underinvested.
Yeah, makes sense. What about the role of sort of partnerships with academic institutions or with other nonprofits, and how does that change kind of your plans and your strategy moving forward? I'm just curious about that because it's often something you see a lot of. You see a lot of people forming alliances, and it's really in the interest of moving the therapy forward. So I don't know if you have any comments, Michelle, in terms of from your perspective in the diagnostic space.
So we have been working on pharma partnerships as well as university partnerships. I don't have a lot of insight into that, but I know that we are working on those. I'm not sure I can go much further into that. Sorry.
That's fine. Yeah.
Well, I think certainly academic partnerships and the other sort of therapeutic area specific partnerships are always going to be, a part of each of these programs, because you can't do everything in-house, and especially when you're talking about novel science, there's lots of academic researchers that are doing interesting aspects of any particular science. And so even when you have a development candidate, there's still lots of collaborations going on, understanding the compound in various different models and things like that. So I think with the kind of things biotechs do, which is very novel, very cutting edge science, you're going to get the best people to be a part of the whole vision.
So that's part of it, is sort of figuring out what do you do internally, what do you parse out to consultants or collaborators, and kind of integrating that all together then, yeah?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that piece of identifying what you can do well internally and what you need to outsource in order to get it done efficiently is kind of the critical part of figuring out the program path, right? And then using the different collaborators across academia, across CROs, et cetera. One of the things that we've found really helpful is we actually have a number of patient foundations who are also investors in Immunitas, so Leukemia Lymphoma Society, Bright Edge out of ACS, and they've been incredibly helpful in terms of connecting us to academics, both for research purposes and as clinical investigators and KOLs. And so I think that has been an evolving role on the patient foundation side, but one that has really created real value.
Yeah, that's great. So I think, these are all the questions kind of came prepared with, but I wanted to ask if there's kind of additional kind of tips and tricks and things like sort of high level, kind of like 3 bullet points, if you wish, if you wanted to like send the audience home with, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and elaborate. But who wants to go first? Praveen?
Well, I don't know if I have 3 bullet points, but one thing that was in the questions that wasn't brought up, actually that Helen actually helped us with, is I thought I'd just share some inside baseball on the quality systems where we didn't actually get it right. In fact, we brought in some very experienced quality folks, right? And at some level, I think we over-invested. I think the quality folks that we brought in-house saw an organization that was willing to invest in quality, came from organizations that underinvest in quality, and so we went the other direction, and of kind of almost like it was a phase 3 program level quality, and there's a little bit of a backlash from other areas of, why do we have to do this much effort at this particular stage? And so I think we actually brought in Halloran and benchmark what is the right level of quality for each stage to kind of calibrate us, and we're just kind of in the beginning process of kind of downsizing a little bit to the stage of the program.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, I was just going to comment on that's an overlooked area, that quality, and even just in kind of the discovery phase. You have to have some things in place in terms of your, electronic notebooks and sort of having SOPs that can be then transferred later. But it's overlooked. So thanks for bringing that up. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll just echo, that is incredibly challenging. Like figuring out exactly what level of quality and SOPs, et cetera, that you need as you make that transition is absolutely a challenge. And it's something that we wrestled with as well. I feel like establishing our quality controls at the discovery level and at the research level was pretty intuitive. And then you make that jump to development. And again, it comes back to the appetite of the company, right? And so it actually parallels regulatory a little bit, where you need the people who are the right match for the stage of the company and the appetite of the company to look at risk, right? And so that is absolutely something that we've found challenging. And it was really a question of finding, in our case, we're a small company, it was a question of finding the right consulting group who appreciated where we were at and how we thought about it and what we were trying to do, and aligned with all of that from a philosophical perspective.
And then there's the education piece that comes in, and sort of socializing it internally and getting buy-in. That I found to be challenging in organizations I've been in. So,
Say the least.
yeah. So, it's good to be able to share kind of our learnings and our insight. But how any learnings that you can put forth to the
Well,
group?
I mean, do you want to go ahead, Sean? I was just going to say, I think it's certainly, my first time as a CEO in this role, and so some of these things were new, and so at some level, my first exposure at this level to quality, and kind of just asking the questions of what are the consequences if we don't have this and that. It was really hard to get answers, on those, and I think that's I'm not sure if we're not asking the question the right way, or if this kind of dialogue hasn't happened previously, but I think that's been a difficult thing for me to figure out is okay, if we don't implement this SOP, what are the consequences of it? Can you give me some odds? And it's really hard to tease that out of people.
Yeah. I found that I learned the most. I sat in on a couple of meetings. We were doing like a quality review of our initial CMC vendor and run. And I sat in on a couple of those meetings just to hear the things that the QA person was bringing up, to see if I was like, yes, that actually does sound like a question we should be asking, versus, oh, is that something we really need to be worrying about? And asking the question afterward about, was that something I really needed to worry about? Or, where are we focusing our attention? And I think we went through a couple QA consultants before I found one where we were sitting on the phone and she was just asking exactly the right questions. And I was like, that is the thing I'm worried about. That's the answer I want to know. And then once we found her, we just stuck with her.
Yeah, that's it. Go ahead.
I think for us, for a quality organization, is not only explaining up why we need certain things, but explaining out, so that our partners who we're collaborating with in software and technology development, they're understanding why we can or we cannot do something. And they're not just sitting isolated, frustrated by something, but like there's true understanding across the organization of why we're doing certain things or why we can't do certain things.
Yeah, it comes down to communication, doesn't it? And sort of making sure everybody's aligned and taking sort of the pulse of that on a regular basis. And I think also engaging early with the FDA really helps with these things, because, for instance, if you're planning a meeting where you're trying to get advice from the FDA on what kind of studies you should do, and they ask a lot of very specific. You can ask specific questions about CMC, about your plans, and you have to have the right, the right criteria there. And so that's feedback that you need to get early, though, in order to be able to write things. And if you go too late, then you can't really fix things. So that's a hard lesson to learn. So I hear from Praveen, quality systems are important. Michelle, what would you like to kind of highlight?
I'll selfishly say HR systems are important. But I think when I first got to Delphi, I was like employee number 89, so we're really small compared to where I'd come from. And so it was all, this new technology, this science. It's new and shiny, and everyone's excited, but eventually that wears off, right? And employees are like, so what have you done for me lately? And so we can't take our eye off the ball of the development and making sure that people feel acknowledged and valued for their contributions. It's not just your regular paycheck, but like, what else are we doing to kind of push out our employer value proposition and making sure that people stay connected to the mission and to the vision, and it's not just an exchange, but they're giving us their discretionary effort and skills just to make sure that we're doing the best that we can, and we don't want that exchange from them.
When you say HR systems, is that processes or something beyond that?
I would say your HRIS system, your payroll system. How are we giving feedback? How are we taking note of goals and accomplishments? How are we doing performance reviews at the end of the day? Because when it comes to your pay, like, how are you telling me that I've done? How are you making a record of this? And how are we really having this conversation about my performance if there's no system of record?
Yeah, I'll say that if I was going to leave people with a key message, it is alignment of the people. Because I think that is so critical when you're thinking about making a big transition, that you need, just to your point, you need the research folks aligned on what they're trying to get to and what happens after that moment where you declared a development candidate. Everyone looks forward to that big milestone moment, but then there's a whole program that happens after it, right? And I think there are people in the research team who want to understand what happens to the compound next. And we had folks when we were interviewing them, and they were like, I really want to know what happens to that antibody after I've made it, right? And so I think there's the alignment of the research team on what it takes to get to a development candidate and what happens to it afterward. And there's alignment of the development team, again, in our case, a mix of consultants and full-time employees who need to be able to see backwards a little bit. Where did this compound come from and what was the intent when it was going through the research process? And then they all need to be able to see forward, right? And so I think, again, alignment of the people, the internal people, the advisors, the consultants who are working on the program, and both the research and development teams.
What have you found worked well with this mix of consultants and internal staff? Because I think that sometimes having an external person coming in and doing an evaluation, say, is one thing versus having somebody sort of embedded within the teams. Mm-hmm. So what have you found works well? And maybe from a HR perspective, has that been a challenge or not?
I think it can be challenging, but it can also work very well. I think one of the experience that we had is just to make sure that your internal people are learning from your external consultant, and we're not just solely dependent on that talent, because if they go away, we want to know, what have you learned from this in this time that they have been here? And then making sure that everyone kind of has their lane and their roles and responsibility, so that there is no friction between the two. Like, we need the talent of both, but just making sure that there are clear lanes and roles and responsibility.
Yeah, I would say in our experience, I would say it definitely can be challenging, and it all comes down to the nature of the person involved. We've had really successful experiences with some consultants, and we've had experience with other consultants where we were like, this just isn't going to be the right fit. And sometimes it was the engagement of the person, sometimes it was the skill set of the person, and sometimes it was the expectation of the role, that we hired them in one capacity, and then our expectation of what that capacity looked like and their expectation were different, right? And that needed to be navigated. And in some cases you're able to work it out, in some cases you're not. The places where it's been successful, it's been incredibly valuable to us. And so I think it really is about finding that fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then, there's so many models to it as well, right? Even from a consulting standpoint, there's those consultants that are consulting completely virtually. There's consultants that are, in-house. One day there's consultants that are full-time for a few months, right? And so it depends on, the situation and the person and the needs.
Yeah, Yeah, I would say one thing that we have found to be incredibly valuable is bringing those people on site for a little while if we can. Partly to build the relationship, to do the expectation setting, to have the team learn from them. And so, like, we have a consulting CBO right now. He's actually flying in today, and to spend a couple days with the team and learn about the different programs and how we think about them, and to talk about strategic planning on the programs, how we think long-term about partnering, how we think long-term about financing based on different milestones. And the same thing with our CMO, who also is coming on site once a month for a few days to spend time with the team and really embed in the program and in the team.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that just fully integrate them into the teams.
Yeah. I think as a consultant, I've worked with different clients in different ways, but I think what works best for me personally, I think, is embedding in the team and learning the culture. And it's different. Every place is different. And you can add maximal value, I think, if you really, get that trust and build the relationship. So great. All right. Well, anything. So we've had a great discussion. Anything else anybody would like to comment before we open it up to the floor here for questions? Any take-homes? I'd say from my perspective, it's bringing in the right people at the right time, and and having the right kind of mix internally. I think that's what we've kind of been talking about the most. So, great. All right. Yeah, so I'd like to open it up, and please feel free to ask any of the panelists or everybody, or target to a specific person depending on your question. Go ahead, and if you can tell us where you're from, and that would be great.
Hi, my name is Ned. I'm from Portland, which is a CDMO. My question is essentially, we've alluded a lot to the risk that is associated with our decision making. I was wondering, what would you say your biggest gambles have been in the process development, or what have you, in your development of this drug?
Well, I can speak to, it's interesting how sometimes these things turn out. So we had two compounds that looked very similar for the most part. They obviously were structurally different, but they're very similar. And this was right before our IPO, and we were thinking, which one should we take forward, right? And interesting enough, we said, well, look, we're being valued on this compound. We have the cash. Let's just take them both forward, and let's just see, and then we'll, depending on the talks, we'll decide later. Well, it was interesting enough is that the one compound immediately failed. And immediately failed. And we're like, oh my God, right? And that other compound looks amazing, right? And they were almost structurally
So
similar,
how far into CMC were you when it failed?
Well, you know what? I can't actually remember, but the talks was within days, right? So I think we were all stunned. We're like, thank God we decided to take them both forward, right? And the other one just had positive phase 2 results. Right, and so that was an interesting gamble that we took there.
But serendipity a little bit, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So you're saying take no bets.
What's that?
So you hedge your bets, don't gamble.
Well, I think understanding what you're valued for, right, and obviously if you not everybody has the luxury to be able to do it, right? Because we just happen to have the cash needed, and we understood kind of what we're valued for and what the consequences and the downside are, but none of us expected. We thought we'd just be deciding which one would be a better drug, right? And one just turned out to be an amazing one, and the other one, died in tox instantly.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that story. I think when I think about the risk that we've taken, the question you're asking actually resonates more as I think forward into the company's future, because I think we are at a moment where, due to external environment, rapid value creation is so critical. And I think it's always been critical in our industry, but I feel like right now, especially small startup companies are being asked to make an incredible amount of progress on a more limited scope of funding with a more limited team, right? And that is just the nature of the world we live in today. And so one of the questions becomes, how do you smartly parallel process? right? How do you think about starting cell line development at the same time you're nominating a development candidate, right? Like, do you still go stepwise? Or do you say, to Praveen's point, today I've got the cash, right? And so I think that's an equation that many small companies are going to have to be thinking through in terms of again, how do you create value very quickly with limited resource, and what makes sense to parallel process.
And being able to pivot maybe, but, and how quickly can you make that pivot if you need to? So go ahead.
Hi, thank you, the panel. Very nice, very good insights. Michelle Lowe with GSK. So I would like to hear your insights about in this environment, when you transition from research to development, the stake is very high. I think Amanda mentioned that. How do you prepare to partner with a big pharma? And also, how do you actually secure next big funding? Because that's a huge development cost will be. From your perspective, what that separates startup companies do this well versus trying to survive, and how do we prepare for it? Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk about our experience, and then I'll pass it to Praveen. So I can tell you what we did. So we have a novel target with an antibody that it's a novel checkpoint for solid tumors and heme malignancies. And when we started the company in 2019, we mapped out a fairly traditional looking development path for that molecule, going again both into heme malignancies and solid tumors. And when we started to talk to companies about partnering, and it was actually the same kind of feedback, both from the sorts of investors that would fund us to go public at some point in the future, and from a lot of the pharma companies that we could consider partnering with. And the feedback was very solid, like, we need to be looking at something that looks like clinical response and efficacy, and we need to see it early. And so we actually regrouped and revamped our phase 1 program to look a little bit more like a phase 2. And it was it was really important for us to do that in order to enable the partnering conversations and the fundraising conversations in the future. And it was a pretty significant revamp of how we thought about the program and what we were driving towards in phase 1. So that's, I would say, how we've incorporated feedback and how we think about partnering. It really is, again, to get back to that point about value creation as efficiently as possible. And sometimes that involves a little bit more risk. But I think in our case, it was critical path to getting to real meaty partnering and financing conversations.
Yeah, I think Morphic is an interesting case study because from the investor standpoint, actually, GSK still holds some of our stock from the SR1 time. We had AbbVie Ventures in the Series A. We had Pfizer Ventures in the Series A. So we had a lot of strategic venture partners. And we've done a number of partnerships. We did a partnership with AbbVie, we did a partnership with Janssen, and so what I've seen and what I think heard from the various kind of the venture groups as well is that we've always had strong interest in our programs as it was kind of a line of sight to a development candidate, right? So once people could see a line of sight to a development candidate, that's where kind of the pharmas got interested in being able to take it forward, at that point. And what I've heard from the venture groups as well, right, is that they felt that their role a bit was finding those early investments, because they felt that, again, we could debate this, but that the pharma is very good from the development candidate onwards, and so their role, these venture groups, was to have a seat at the table, earlier than that, so they'd be in a position to partner with that company, at the development candidate stage. So I do think that the challenge is that I think getting the value right there is the hard part, because I do think that the interest does start coming in at the development candidate stage, but you're also in a period of time where the capital to get to some sort of whatever you call a proof of concept is not that far either, right? And so getting that sort of the value to kind of match on both sides is the hard part at that stage. But I think biotechs are willing to partner at that stage if we can get the value to sort of the calculation to come to one that's productive for both sides.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have also seen the goalpost move in the past couple of years. And we've certainly seen that in immuno-oncology and in precision oncology. I expect that it's happening in a number of different therapeutic areas where the bar has just gone up in the past couple of years. And I think to a certain extent, there's been a little bit of an overcorrection. And I expect that it will revert to a mean over the next year or so. But I think in this particular moment, there's definitely been a raising of the bar.
Just to add here, I definitely say for us coming out of Series B, the feedback was value. And so we have kind of toned down some of the research projects, like focusing in, zoning in to try to get to market to create that value very quickly.
Hi, thank you for the insight. My name is Angela, and I'm from Tonga America Corps. My question is, when I was listening to the panel discussion, there was like common themes about, it's very important for it to be agile, adaptive, and flexible. And I come from a large company, so there's a more struggle internally to do that. But I was wondering if you have some insights or more concrete examples on how you personally were able to kind of achieve this as a company to continuously stay mobile and adaptable and flexible, like something that you do, whether is it hiring or creating a new position or, just kind of like structure-wise, if you can have some comments on that.
Well, I think one aspect, I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but one thing, I remember one of our head of biology, she came from Merck. She's at Janssen now, but she was our head of biology for a number of years. And she said, she came from Merck, and she said that about this was probably like 3 or 4 months into coming to Morphic, is that she said that I didn't believe any of the timelines when I was interviewing here, but now that I've been here for a few months, you know what? Maybe it is possible, right? And I think that one of the things that a biotech is good at, right, is a very fluid decision making that's not possible in big organizations. And I had to use Morphic as a case study in a way, in the sense that we're physically in the AstraZeneca buildings, right? And so I say it's not as well known in the biotech world, but in the tech world they have this thing called A/B testing. It's when Google shows you a page versus you a page, and then understands what the differences are and the response and things like that. I always say that we're the biotech A/B testing, because given that we are a structure-based drug design company, so largely similar discovery approach to the way big pharma does small molecules well. We're in the same buildings, we have the same equipment, we have the same facilities, largely the same people, because there's been fluidity between the people as well. But our timelines are at least 2 or 3 times as fast, right? And so it kind of just goes to show you, right, that the difference is really in the processes and the culture, in the decision making, more so than any specific component of it, right? So I think that's one thing that I have also seen that our discovery group has been really good at, is that I think a lot of biotechs kind of going to senior governance often have. Just because we're starting at a discovery stage, having discovery make PowerPoints and things like that constantly to see the progress. I started out, again, first time CEO, I started out that way as well. But I kind of realized that I'm not adding any value to this at all, right? And I saw how well they're good at fluidly, switching resources to programs that are working themselves. And so I think that's the way we've been able to be really quick with new programs and putting investment where they're seeing progress and the people that are kind of closest to the program, rather than this kind of overarching senior management, monthly, quarterly decision making.
Yeah, there's sort of 2 points I want to build on there. One is the hiring of those people that have that adaptability and have that flexibility in their mindset. And one of the things that we ask when we're interviewing is for examples of creative problem solving. And examples of times when people had to pursue alternative paths and what was their contribution to that. And what we're looking for are people who are proactive generators of that kind of problem solving and that kind of alternative thinking. And we're looking for it for exactly the reason that Praveen mentioned around like, how do you take some, if you're hiring someone who's used to timelines that are X number of months and you want them to come into an organization where they're going to look at it and say, I'm not sure that's possible, right? And you want them to say, oh, how do I learn how to do that? And how do I make that possible? And what are the ideas that I can bring to the table to make that possible? And so that's a huge part of what we hire for also. And then the other piece around the corporate culture is, again, instilling that as a core value in the team as well.
Totally agree with Amanda. There are times when you need a subject matter expert, and there are times where you can hire a utility player that's able to be flexible and adaptable. And I think the other thing, we also talk about fit for purpose. So your processes, your SOPs, like they don't have to be so regulated. Like, what do you need at the time to make sure you can get to the next milestone and be flexible within that?
Do you ever have to retreat and clean a lot of that up? Have you missed certain things that 6-9 months from now you wish you'd have done back in September?
I think, we've, maybe it's pure luck, but we've had a really great trajectory right from the get-go. Our discovery team has been really phenomenal. And so we've done really well. So there's no huge regrets. I think the probably where it comes up is where we haven't been aggressive enough, actually, because we are a fairly conservative organization. In all respects, and we hire very industry experienced folks and stuff like that. So I actually, it's funny because I would say sometimes the CSO and CEO role, I say maybe should be switched at Morphic, because I'm the one all the time saying, slow down, patience, take your time, don't cut corners, right? Because there's so many things that can go wrong. And Bruce, who's fantastic, he was our CSO for all these years, came for 5 years, he's as aggressive as can be, let's go, right? And so I think it's getting that balance right. But I think the things that sort of come to mind are where we were too conservative, actually, and we could have been a little bit more aggressive.
Aggressive, but not cut too many corners as well. You have to sort of balance that, right?
Well, when I say aggressive, we're being careful with the cash, and so until that program is at a certain stage, we're not going to do anything more here, right? And so, fortunately, again, our programs have done well, fortunately, and so we could have done more if we knew that.
Yeah, I'll give you a classic first-time CEO answer. So I stepped into the CEO role just about 2 years ago, and after having been head of strategy for the company for the first year. So we founded the company in 2019. I came in as head of strategy, really because we had this novel target that was discovered in glioma, and the question was, how do we, as a small biotech company, initially push it into the clinic? What are we going to do with that? With eyes on glioma long term, but in the meantime, what are the other cancers that are more tractable for us as a small company? So became the CEO after the Series B, and I think lots of times when you talk to first-time CEOs, the thing they talk about is not making difficult personnel changes fast enough, right? And it is a core value to me that when we make hard decisions around personnel, we do so with compassion and respect. And I would add to that compassion, respect, and speed. Because the longer you let someone linger who isn't a good fit, the more painful it becomes for the organization, for the team, and for that person. And so looking back on it, I think there are moments where I could have done that faster.
Thank you. I'm Mickey Rigo. I'm from Curia, another CDMO. I've heard a few CDMOs here. One of the common themes that I've heard from you guys is instilling a corporate culture that can enable value creation and speed quickly. One of the other complexities I feel like when you go from research to development is your supply chain and vendor management becomes more complex, as well too. So what approaches do you take to instill those values and that culture across partners that might have their own values and cultures to still maintain that common goal of value creation and speed?
I mean, it's a difficult problem. I mean, because I think like you said, is that oftentimes the bottlenecks, the things that can go wrong are not in the organization, they're external to the organization. And those, for any biotech, you're going to have lots of those partners and things like that, right? So I think where I think we came out, right, and we're very functional in the sense that we want a culture where the functional heads make the decisions. So we do try to push it down, these decisions that ultimately, you get to make the decision, but ultimately you're going to be responsible for the outcome as well. So I think with a lot of the vendors, where that's come out, not because we prescribed it, is people have been comfortable working with vendors that they've worked with before, right? And that they've had trust and things like that. So I think that's how kind of we managed it, and the functional head sort of managed risk, is that they just were comfortable working with groups that they've worked with before, and I think that's kind of where it came out.
Yeah, I'll pull back here a couple companies ago, and this is the fourth startup that I've been a part of, and so if I go back to number 2, we had a partnership with a large pharma company, and I think the expectations when the deal was done were not well aligned in terms of how fast the program could move and strategically what to do with it. And so I think that piece of, during the BD process, making sure that the teams are aligned, making sure that the teams have met each other, making sure that the goals are pretty well articulated. I think whenever you end up in a partnership like that, it slows down some progress just because you have more people at the table who are making the decision, right? And that inevitably adds some time component. But I think if both companies are aligned on the end goal and the general time frame to get there, that is a really important foundation for a successful BD deal.
And if I could just add where my alliance management hat, I've worked in alliance management for a few years, so I think it's very important to have clear lanes for who's responsible for what. I think putting that into the alliance management kind of discussions, the BD discussions early on, and defining that really well, that helps a lot. So it avoids miscommunication, and the person who has to make the ultimate decision and the driver of the relationship is key. So, yeah. Great. All right, wonderful. Well, I think we're out of time officially. Thank you so much. I wanted to just alert you to a couple of other Mass Bio events. The one coming up soon is July 19th. It's the Christmas in July. So this is an open house to see how you can make your holiday party spectacular. The other event right afterwards, July 20th, is the annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference, and the theme this year is Health Equity. And lastly, there's going to be an event at the Seaport in August, so keep your eyes open for that. And with that, I'd like to thank our fellow panelists here. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for spending part of your morning with us.
Thanks, Katie.